Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Sunday School Teacher Workshop. We are on the fifth lesson of this unit, which will be the last lesson of this unit as we round out Joshua, skipping over the last five chapters from 18, where we were last week. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We were in chapter 11 last week. That's right. So we are making quite the leap. Okay. All right. So all the way to Joshua 24, where the book ends. So, offering you the title, Standing Before the Tree, the test is issued once more. So, the whole goal behind this, if you recall from that 10-minute vignette, is just to try to trace the pattern and call attention to this by this green block here at the top. The pattern that we've seen play out multiple times, starting in Genesis. And of course, there are more examples than what I've offered here. But while this is not an exhaustive list, hopefully enough to kind of help you connect those dots. Now, the reason why this is important, I think, is because again, we're always trying to strive and help our students appreciate the meta narrative of Scripture before we start to drill down into individual points of application. Now, this is a tempting passage because when you look at verses, I think 15 and 19, places like that, then you have Joshua issuing the challenge: get rid of these foreign gods. Choose this day who you will worship. And of course, a declarative statement like that is something that we could camp out on, and it would not be an inappropriate thing to do. However, rather than making it a point to make the entire lesson built around the idea of Israel choosing the gods that they are going to serve, and this being a call for us to make sure that we rid ourselves of the idols that we allow to easily infiltrate our lives. I would say first we focus on how the story fits on into the entire meta narrative of Scripture. And we see a pattern that's being repeated here. Why this is an important moment for Israel as it sets them up for the transition from the generation who has been very, very faithful in many cases, not completely. They had their sputtering starts in the book of Numbers. This was the generation that was responsible for groaning out in the wilderness, and Moses struck the rock rather than speaking to it, which does not justify his actions. He is certainly what's the word I'm trying to find here? Guilty. Looking for something else. He's certainly guilty of his actions. But nonetheless, it was that moment that caused him to become very heated whenever these people were grumbling yet again, having apparently not learned from their ancestors that God will not only provide, but that what he provides is sufficient in every way. And I believe it was this generation as well who were the ones who perhaps were lured away by Balak when they were positioned in Moab. Because remember, Moab is the place where Moses delivers the content of Deuteronomy. It's the place where he formally installs Joshua as the successor that's going to replace him. It's in Moab that he winds up dying. It's in Moab that they staged the crossing through the Jordan River. So it was also in Moab when Balak, king of Moab, was attempting to try to curse them through the prophet Balaam. And of course, there was one more moment of apostasy when men of the people started to engage in cultic sex with Midianite women, worshiping their gods at their altars, and it cost the lives of many Israelites and so forth. So, anyway, they've had their moments, but after that, when Joshua winds up taking over and crossed through the Jordan River, they remain united in a conquest that lasted at least 7 years, maybe longer. I should say at least 5 years, maybe up to 7. And during that time period, they were again united around the complete task of driving out all the Canaanites and putting as many of them to the sword as they could until the army was officially disbanded. And then that army, after they began to settle into the inheritance that they've seized for themselves, take on rest for the remainder of that generation. It wasn't only Joshua, but also the elders that ruled along with him that helped keep the people accountable. We're told in the beginning of the book of Judges that for the remainder of that generation, the people were faithful, but then a new generation comes along. right? So in that, the Lord allows this generation to appreciate the fruit of what their labor has afforded them by virtue of their faithfulness. And now, as a new generation is about to take over, this becomes the transitional moment where at the end of Joshua, we're seeing this generation that's responsible for the conquest pledge themselves to faithfulness. But as we transition into the book of Judges, we can see how that will fade away. So this kind of serves to help us appreciate this ebb and flow pattern where we've had these peak moments where God has revealed himself to a particular person, where he's shared revelation, where he's commanded them to do something, to undertake a particular task or whatnot. But then very shortly after that, either within that very same chapter, or maybe the next chapter, we see that that person winds up doing something rather calamitous, and it brings destruction in some way, even if it's on a very small scale. Like the story with Abraham and Hagar, when Abraham gives in to what his wife has said, and then winds up taking Hagar essentially as a second wife and conceives a child. And then, of course, in all of that, as Sarai becomes jealous of Hagar, who has now not only garnered attention from Abraham, even though it was at Sarai's request, Sarai is expecting to be treated like a wife. And when she starts to buck up to Sarai, and Sarai, of course, literally beats her down. And that kind of shamefulness, of course, winds up greatly hurting Hagar. So all that to say, it can happen on a very small scale, or it can happen even on a national scale. Because the first instance of this with Abraham was in chapter 12 of Genesis, when he was first called, migrates to the land, sees what God has for him, at least as far as he can, with the power of the naked eye as he's walking through the land. But he walks through the land enough to realize there's a famine. And then, of course, he decides to move on to Egypt. And when he does that, he lies to Pharaoh, and God has to bring plagues upon the entire land to rescue Sarai from the groups of Pharaoh, who was acquisitioned her, placed her in his harem. So that to say, this is yet another part of that long and drawn out pattern in which we have the people who are on a peak moment, because here they have defeated all of the tribes of Canaan. Of course, there are pockets of people who are left to be routed out of there. Many of us know that. But that is going to be the test for the next generation. I'm not sure if it's appropriate for us to appreciate what Joshua does in disbanding the army as a failure to completely drive out the Amorites. And by virtue of that, then God has to pick up where Joshua failed and then advance this objective into the next generation, but rather that God had all along been establishing a test for the second generation who had not really known war. This generation are the children of those who have been doing a lot of fighting, and because they are at home, they are kept safe back in the encampment while their fathers are going out to fight. They are the ones that are going to have to learn what it's like to trust Yahweh in battle and know that he will provide for them. And by virtue of that, learn to not only trust, but then be obedient to God's command, right? So anyway, let's dive into this a little bit. I'm not going to embellish too much on the stuff that's on the top of the screen, rather just give you enough to help us make sure that we can connect the dots in this pattern so that when we jump into Joshua chapters 23 and 4, then we can understand a little bit more about what's going on. So Genesis chapter 3 in the garden is the first test that's ever issued to humanity. And by virtue of that, we have God telling Adam and Eve very clearly that they are not supposed to eat of the tree. Perhaps it's better for me to say, or more accurate for me to say, that God told Adam this, and then of course Adam relayed this information to his wife Eve. But then when this information is first tested by the serpent being coming to the woman, and he asks, what did God say? And then of course the woman regurgitates the information to the serpent. She says, God said, you must not eat, because in the day that you do, you will surely die. But what does she do after she listens to the alternative truth claim? She winds up taking some of the fruit and eating nonetheless. Clearly, she failed the test. God had spoken, And yet that was not deemed to be wise in her eyes in comparison to what the serpent being offered and what could have been perhaps better wisdom than what Yahweh had offered. Again, we see several other instances of this between Genesis chapter 3 and then Exodus chapter 20 up through 32. But the point I want to make here as it relates to Israel, because this is the moment when Israel as a corporate Adam has been brought into the mix. We've been introduced to them, of course, in the earlier chapters of the book of Exodus, but most of it, the content of the book up to this point has been Israel's redemption or ransoming out of Egypt. It wasn't until chapter 19 that they've actually fully escaped Egypt and then been brought unto the Lord at Mount Sinai. So, as in Genesis chapter 3, as Adam and Eve were in the garden, here we have another garden scene at Sinai. And I say that because even though they are out in the desert, the garden itself is supposed to be a prototypical temple where God and man have met, which is all the ingredients that are necessary for a temple environment to be established, a place where heaven and earth are nexused together. And this is exactly what we see at Mount Sinai as God has descended upon the summit of the mountain, fire and smoke. And then he begins to speak to the people as he spoke to Adam and Eve himself in the garden. He is speaking to them, the corporate Adam, here in Exodus chapters 19 and 20. First, he speaks to Moses, but then when the people are gathered, he is the one talking directly to them, and he tells them, "You are not to have any other gods before me." And they resoundingly state more than once, "We will do everything that the Lord has commanded." But yet, several chapters later, in Exodus chapter 32, once this golden calf has been forged by Aaron and then brought out before the people, someone shouts out, "Israel, these are your gods." And of course, they not only bow and worship, but they hold a festival to it the next day when Moses winds up finding them, because that is what the Lord told him was going on as he's rushing down. Then, more than a year later, in Numbers chapter 14, when they are outside the new provincial Eden. So remember, at this point, they are carrying with them the portable Garden of Eden. So they are about to move into the new provincial Eden. The Garden of Eden itself was just a garden located in the province of Eden, but God had planted it. So Canaan is going to become the new provincial Eden while they are carrying with them the garden. So remember, way back in Exodus chapter 3, the Lord shows up to Moses and he speaks to him in the burning bush, and he says, "I have come down to bring them to a good land." And of course, this would go all the way back to Genesis chapter 15, when the Lord promised this land to Abraham and all of his descendants after him. They would inherit every single bit of it after the sin of the Amorites has reached its full measure, and the Lord winds up bringing ultimate judgment upon them. So, a centuries old promise stretching all the way back to their predecessor, their forebearer, Abraham. So, the promise that now is advanced through Moses to the people, and they clearly see firsthand in all the plagues that are exacted upon Egypt what the Lord is willing to do, what the Lord has done to ransom them out of Egypt. They see once again at the Red Sea what the Lord is going to do to all the enemies who try to stand between them and Yahweh when it comes to accomplishing the mission that Yahweh has given his people. They have watched as the Lord has made unpalatable water sweet for them to be able to drink, that he brings them to an oasis out in the wilderness for them to be able to sup, to take nourishment, to feed and water themselves and their animals, their families, and so forth. And of course, he's brought them here to Sinai. I should say, brought them there to Sinai, where for a full year they were there basking in his presence as he is on the summit of the mountain. And there again is manna on the ground every day, water coming forth from the rock to care for all their needs. And then now, as they've traveled a little bit more than a few weeks out in the wilderness, they are in Canaan, and these spies have brought out a batch of fruit that they see as produce of the land, and they know that they are truly about to go into a land filled with milk and honey until they hear the bad news that's on par with the alternative truth claim that the serpent being offered here in the first garden. And what happens? They say, "Wouldn't it be better for us to just go back to Egypt? This seems wiser in their eyes than what Yahweh has promised Abraham, what has been passed forth through Moses." And if they hadn't come to their senses that night, they would have actually done this. They had chosen to kill Moses and to elect a new leader to lead them back to Egypt for this very purpose. Okay, so we can see, I think, pretty easily in this that there are three good examples of how we have God speaking at some point in the portion of this narrative, making it very clear what he wants and what he intends and what the people will receive. But yet we have the people weighing out for themselves what seems to be wise in their own eyes versus what Yahweh has proclaimed. Maybe a better way of putting that would be weighing out what Yahweh has said, and then weighing out what else might be a possible option, and then deciding for themselves what is ultimately wise, rather than recognizing what Yahweh says is always wise and nothing else even remotely compares. All right, so even though our text is in Joshua 24, we need to appreciate something here in Joshua 23 first. Because in Joshua 23, here we have Joshua speaking to the people yet again. So this is the part of the speech that actually precedes the event in Joshua 24. So he says, I have allotted these remaining nations an inheritance. Now, it's important for us to recognize, even though we're not there yet, and I'm going to be jumping into the book of Judges a little early, even though next week we're going to be getting right into this particular text. I want to do this to help us make sure that we're understanding how this sets us up for what comes next, right? And how Joshua 23, of course, bleeds into 24 and why the context of 23 is so important. Because in Judges chapter 2, we have the angel of the Lord, the very same figure, who in Exodus chapter 3 spoke to Moses and told him what they are to do, or I should say what he is to do and what the people are going to be doing once they wind up leaving the land. He is the one who winds up taking the people up to Bochim, and he tells them, you've not obeyed me. And he asks the question, what have you done? The very question that the Lord asks the woman once Adam blames her for the sin that they have committed. And it's the very same question that he asks Cain after the Lord discovers that Abel has been brutally slain in the field. And Abel's blood cries out unto the Lord, and he approaches Cain to see what it was that he did when the Lord offered him the chance to do what was right. And if he does so, he will be acceptable or accepted, rather than do what he had previously done, which caused the Lord to reject his sacrifice, right? The angel of the Lord asks, what is it that you have done rather than obey me? So when we back up from Judges chapter 2 verse to Judges chapter 1, we can see that though Judah, the first tribe to go and take their inheritance, was actually successful, and Simeon partnered with them, and Simeon winds up taking a portion of land within the heart of Judah's territory. Those two tribes were successful. But here I provide you a list of 7 tribes: the Benjaminites, the Western Manassites, Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan, who were all completely unsuccessful in driving out the people from their inheritance. Now, because they were unsuccessful, obviously, the people who remain there are going to become thorns in their sides. This is what the angel of the Lord is going to be telling them in Judges chapter 2. But the reason why they failed to drive them is clearly because they were not faithful to the Lord. It wasn't that the Lord pulled back because he liked this generation less. It was because this generation did not give themselves fully over to Yahweh and trusted him faithfully. If the Lord, for whatever reason, did not like them as they liked the previous generation, he would not have allowed success for Judah and Simeon. But as it was, Judah is the tribe that Caleb comes from. And so clearly, Caleb seemed to be somewhat influential amongst them and helping motivate them to be faithful and, of course, go and do the very thing that they wind up doing. But the others, on the other hand, for whatever reason, as this new generation winds up rising up in the place of their ancestors, fail to be as faithful or to have the same level of solidarity that either the Judites and the Simeonites or the previous generation of Israelites had. So they failed to drive out these people. And of course, with that, as you can see, standing before the tree, they are told, this is the inheritance that's been allotted for them. The test is issued to them whether or not they will be faithful, and they are failing in that regard. Now, to draw back from Judges, back to Joshua 23, to go over to Joshua 24, here we pick up in our host text. And this is what Joshua winds up telling the people. They are to fear the Lord and to worship him in sincerity and in truth. And this is what they resoundingly say. Not once, not twice, But in the body of the text that we have for our lesson, they say three times, we will certainly not abandon the Lord to worship other gods. And yet, when we get into Judges chapter 3, this is exactly what we're finding. So the payoff does not yet come in the book of Joshua, but we do see it in the book of Judges. The Israelites ultimately wind up worshiping other gods. So my point in all this is to simply say that when we look at Joshua chapter 24 and its contents, and what we should appreciate is that Joshua chapter 24 should be seen first as being on par with the contents of stories like Genesis chapter 3. Many of these are this is the particular story that's in the backdrop. As I've said before, the microcosm by which many of these other biblical stories are plastered against to see how it's going to play out with this new particular Adam figure, whether it's a person or people, actually succeed in their mission of being faithful to Yahweh. And at points in their story development, that may very well be. David's a good example of that, as he is faithful many, many times. But then when it comes to the crescendo of his story in 2 Samuel 7, this is when he has his Genesis 3 moment when he chooses to disobey Yahweh. By virtue of that, brings destruction on the house and family of Uriah and Bathsheba. And of course, looking at other stories like this that pertain specifically to the corporate Adam, Israel, we've seen how this has cost the former generation all of their inheritance as they wind up dying out in the wilderness. This new generation, the ones who've been battling alongside Joshua, have been faithful. So it's not so much them that we're looking at here. Of course, it's the generation that will come behind them that will be primarily raised in the land. And no doubt many of them will run out of the wilderness because as their parents ran out old enough, at least 20 years of age or older, they were the ones backfilling the ranks of the Israelite army from their parents, who were the ones who left Egypt as adults, 20 years or older. And of course, all died in the wilderness. This new generation, who are the ones responsible for fighting, raising those children in the wilderness, or giving birth to them in the land of Canaan. And now the time has come. And we don't know exactly how much time passes from Joshua leaving the scene and then the last of those elders to help keep that generation of Israelites faithful unto Yahweh finally die out before we wind up getting into this new generation. But it's only in the span of one generation, of course. And we know this because the very first judge to arise and begin the cycle of judges is Othniel. Othniel is the son-in-law of Caleb. We learn that story from the book of Judges. So it's not that much years, perhaps, more likely. But then again, Othniel judges for 40 years, and so Othniel is not an old man by the time he winds up taking on this mantle of being a judge. So presumably, the generation of elders winds up passing away relatively quickly. So anyway, point being is that when we look at the story on par with that, then we can see the connection between Joshua and Judges, which is important for us to grasp, is yet again another setup here for them to faithfully vow to Yahweh, we will do this, and then to hold themselves truthful to it. And the question that we should be asking as we move into Judges, acting as though we don't know what the content of that book is whether or not they will be faithful to that. So this generation is faithful, but the generation behind them is also responsible for being faithful to this. In fact, as soon as we get past verse 24, I believe that's the last verse of this, I'm sorry, verse 25, in this context, we are told that Joshua actually drafts a covenant for them to sign. So this covenant, of course, is supposed to have intergenerational consequence. And sadly, it is not something that is adhered to by their very children after them, who faithlessly wind up throwing themselves into the arms of other gods, and by virtue of this, God severely punishes them. And then, of course, after this, you can build upon the idea that naturally, as Israel pledged themselves to worship Yahweh, then we have done the same thing as we have entered into this redemptive relationship with Yahweh through His Son. And by virtue of us being redeemed, we are to be completely faithful, fully solidarious to Yahweh and Yahweh alone. He alone deserves our praise. It's a bit of an interesting saying. Joshua says, if it does not please you to worship Yahweh, then choose yourselves who you will worship. And we would say, Well, wait a minute now, based off the great catechistic teaching that comes from, say, the Westminster Catechism or others like it. The Lord is worthy of worship, whether we want to worship Him or not. And of course, worshiping Him brings us the greatest possible good and benefit that we as human beings could ever aspire to, because of course He will bless us in infinitesimal ways that we cannot possibly comprehend. This is all true, but nonetheless, even though Yahweh is worthy of worship, this is how Joshua phrases it: choose this day. If it doesn't please you to worship Yahweh, go after the gods you want, but know that God will destroy you if you do this, because you have found favor in His eyes. And He will not let any race of human beings do this forever and get away with it. You are the ones that He has chosen. You are the ones He has covenanted with. You are the ones He has given this mission to reconcile the nations unto Him. And do that by virtue of the way that you live, the character of your conduct, and various other things of life. So, all that to say, it's important for us to establish this first, I think, and then we can get down into those particulars of what Joshua has to say regarding whether or not they will serve Yahweh. And then, of course, the reaction of these people, and then how Joshua brought them into a covenant. They've already bound themselves into a covenant that their forebears made at Sinai, right, to obey the Ten Commandments. So this is not necessarily a different covenant or a new covenant that's superseding that. It's just something supplemental and additional to that, to say this generation decided to be perhaps the first generation who is actually going to hold true to what Yahweh had commanded them. And they do until they die. Of course, it's their children that choose to rebel. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you for listening. So we'll get together next week. Thanks.